Mystery cults in the ancient world can be understood as a deeply personal form of religion, shaped by individual choice and driven by the desire to come closer to the divine. Many scholars have long searched for hidden spiritual meanings within these practices, imagining them as gateways to profound, almost mystical truths. Yet focusing too much on distant, abstract ideas can cause something much more immediate to be overlooked. Alongside these secretive rites existed a simpler and far more widespread form of personal belief, grounded in everyday life. This was the practice of making vows to the gods, a tradition that formed the foundation upon which many mystery rituals were built. In times of fear, illness, danger, or even success, people would turn to the gods with promises. A sailor facing a storm, a parent worried for a child, or a merchant hoping for profit might all offer the same kind of bargain. If the gods grant help, a gift will be given in return. These offerings could range from small tokens to valuable objects, and they filled sanctuaries across the ancient world. From Greece to Rome, from Anatolia to distant regions beyond, sacred spaces became crowded with these items. Many were eventually cleared away, treated almost like refuse. Yet each one represented a personal story, filled with anxiety, hope, and relief. Every object stood as proof that someone had believed, had asked, and felt they had received an answer. For powerful leaders, the greatest danger was war, and their vows often took the form of grand temples or monuments dedicated after victory. For ordinary people, life's uncertainties were closer to home. The risks of childbirth, the dangers of travel, especially by sea, and the constant threat of illness shaped their prayers. Surviving a storm or recovering from sickness often led to offerings placed in gratitude. These acts were not rare or unusual. They were part of daily life, a practical way of dealing with uncertainty. At its core, this practice created a kind of agreement with the future. Faced with unpredictable events, individuals imposed a simple structure on their hopes. If the desired outcome occurred, then something would be given up in return. This exchange made uncertainty feel manageable. It allowed people to act, to hope, and to move forward instead of remaining trapped in fear. Once a vow was fulfilled, it often led to another. A person might ask for continued protection, promising yet another offering in the future, creating an ongoing relationship with the divine. These experiences were emotionally intense. A person in distress would search for help, make a decision to trust in a god, and later interpret success as divine intervention. Dreams, visions, and sudden insights were often seen as signs guiding these choices. Even those who doubted such beliefs could not deny their impact. Survival itself reinforced faith. Those who lived through danger believed they had been saved. In each case, the conclusion felt certain. The gods had answered. This system also worked on a social level. Vows were made publicly and fulfilled in visible ways. Offerings supported craftsmen, merchants, and priests. Ritual meals brought communities together. Personal struggles became shared experiences, and individuals found encouragement from others who had gone through similar hardships. Religion, in this form, was not isolated or abstract. It was woven into daily life, connecting individuals through shared practices and mutual support. Faith in this context did not mean rejecting other beliefs or fully transforming one's identity. It was flexible and practical. People did not abandon old traditions when turning to a new god. Instead, they added new possibilities, testing different approaches in search of results. If one god did not seem effective, another might be tried. This openness encouraged constant change and adaptation. Over time, new religious trends emerged, sometimes spreading widely, sometimes remaining temporary and local. Within this environment, mystery cults developed as a more specialized expression of the same needs. Initiation into these cults offered another way to seek protection healing, or success. The motivations were often similar to those behind ordinary vows. People joined not only for spiritual reasons, but because they hoped for real, tangible benefits in their lives. As new gods and rituals appeared, they fit naturally into this system, offering fresh solutions to familiar problems. The spread of foreign deities followed the same pattern. Gods associated with healing, protection, and prosperity gained followers quickly. Many inscriptions and monuments dedicated to these figures show clear signs of personal vows. People asked for health, safety, wealth, and the well-being of their families. High mortality rates made prayers for children especially common. Even rulers were included in these acts, with offerings made for their safety and success. Healing played a central role in many of these practices. Certain deities became widely known for curing illness, and their sanctuaries attracted large numbers of visitors. Evidence suggests that these places were not only spiritual centers, but also sources of income, supported by offerings and fees. Rituals involving sleep, dreams, and symbolic acts were believed to bring recovery. In some cases, confession of wrongdoing was also part of the process, offering emotional relief alongside physical healing. At the same time, these gods were believed to influence many other aspects of life. Wealth, success in business, and even changes in personal fortune were attributed to divine favor. People did not seek abstract salvation in a distant future. What they wanted was improvement in their present lives. Protection, prosperity, and stability were the true goals. Ritual spaces themselves became places where these hopes were renewed. In certain cults, participants gathered to share meals, celebrate fulfilled vows, and strengthen their sense of community. These experiences reinforced belief, creating a cycle in which faith was continually renewed through shared success. Victory, especially for soldiers, was closely tied to divine support, further strengthening these traditions. In some cases, initiation rituals were repeated over time, reflecting the idea that divine protection needed renewal. Rather than a single life-changing transformation, these practices offered ongoing reassurance. Life was extended, improved, and protected, but always within the same world. Even the most dramatic rituals were ultimately focused on maintaining well-being in the present. Stories of individuals devoted to these cults often show a similar pattern. A person might begin in uncertainty or crisis, turn to a god, and later achieve success. This success was then seen as proof of divine favor. When new problems arose, the same religious practices were repeated. Rather than withdrawing from society, such individuals often became more integrated into it, using their faith as a source of stability and confidence. Across different traditions, the same themes appear again and again. Health, wealth, safety, and emotional relief were the central concerns. Rituals involving music, dance, and intense emotional expression were sometimes used to treat psychological distress. These experiences allowed individuals to release tension and feel renewed. Even when described in religious terms, their effects were practical and immediate. Some cults became especially associated with protection from specific dangers, such as sea travel. Others were linked to agriculture and the promise of a good harvest. Even the most famous and respected religious centers were connected to these practical needs. Offerings were made, blessings were sought, and rituals were performed to ensure stability and survival. In the end, these practices reveal a consistent pattern. Ancient religion was not only about distant gods or abstract ideas. It was a system designed to help people face uncertainty, overcome fear, and find meaning in their experiences. Mystery cults, far from being isolated or mysterious in the modern sense, were part of this larger framework. They offered new methods, new symbols, and new promises. But their purpose remained the same: to provide hope, reassurance, and a sense of control in an unpredictable world. There was also another unusual side to the Eleusinian tradition, one that connected it to healing rites and to older ideas that seemed to have travelled between cultures. In the story of Demeter at Eleusis, the goddess is welcomed into the royal household and secretly tries to make the queen's child immortal by placing him in the fire at night. The mother, terrified by what she sees, interrupts the act. At that moment, the goddess reveals her true nature, and in place of the immortality that was almost granted, the sacred rites are established. This story is striking not only because of its drama, but because it resembles patterns known from Egyptian religious healing traditions. In Egyptian sacred stories, Isis wanders in hardship and is refused proper welcome by a woman of the house. Soon after, the woman's young son is struck by disaster through the force that follows Isis, and the home itself is threatened by fire. Yet the same goddess who could bring danger also becomes the one who shows mercy and restores the child. In these traditions, the wandering goddess, the endangered child, the threat of burning, and the final rescue all belong to one powerful religious pattern. That pattern was not just a simple story told for entertainment. It belonged to a world in which illness, fever, bites, and sudden suffering were understood through sacred narrative and treated through ritual words and divine power. In Egyptian practice, the sick child could be identified with the divine child himself, and the act of healing became part prayer, part sacred reenactment. When this larger background is considered, the similarities with the Demeter story become hard to dismiss. The resemblance goes beyond a few shared images. It suggests a deeper link between myth, danger, healing, and divine presence. This may point to Egyptian influence on Eleusinian myth at a very early stage, especially in an environment where practical healing rites and sacred storytelling were closely connected. Even so, the Eleusinian mysteries developed in a very different direction. Whatever healing themes may stand near their origins, the rites at Eleusis did not become a collection of charms for everyday emergencies. Their central promise was not immediate rescue from danger, but a more elevated condition often described as blessedness. This blessing was tied above all to what awaited beyond death. Demeter was not only the giver of grain and fertility in this life, she also offered the hope that those who had witnessed the sacred rites would receive a better fate after the grave. That promise is expressed again and again across centuries. From the earliest hymn to later funerary language, Eleusis was remembered as a place where death itself was presented in a different light. The sacred revelation did not deny sorrow, but it claimed that death was not simply an evil. In the most famous ancient summaries, the rites at Eleusis taught people how to live with joy and how to face the end with stronger hope. The promise remained mysterious. Ancient writers never explained it in a clear and simple formula. Yet that was part of its force. It was not described in detail, but it was treated as something weighty, serious, and transformative. The person who had seen the rites was believed to possess a different relationship to death than the one who had not. The mysteries did not reject life or call for withdrawal from the world. They did not preach suffering as a virtue, but they did place a strong emphasis on what lay beyond the visible world, and that emphasis gave them their lasting power. A similar development can be seen in the rites connected with Dionysus. Many modern interpretations have tried to reduce Dionysiac worship to emotion, ecstasy, and earthly celebration. But ancient evidence shows that these rites also carried powerful hopes for the afterlife. This dimension was already present in the classical age. Ritual specialists promised not only relief in this life, but also protection beyond death. Those who entered the sacred rites expected more than temporary comfort. They believed the ceremonies mattered after the grave as well. Gold tablets placed with the dead describe initiates moving through the underworld on a sacred path toward a blessed condition. Comic poetry imagines initiates still celebrating joyful festivals below the earth. Certain burial grounds were reserved for those who had taken part in Bacchic rites, and inscriptions from tombs record ecstatic Dionysiac identity as something worth preserving even in death. These ideas did not always take the form of a fully defined doctrine. The language of hope often remained poetic, symbolic, and open-ended. Yet the pattern is unmistakable. The uninitiated are shown missing out, still burdened, still trapped in meaningless labour, while those who took part in the sacred ceremonies are imagined as free, joyful, and at peace. In southern Italy and beyond, Dionysiac imagery became one of the most powerful ways of speaking about death in art. Vast painting, funerary monuments, and later sarcophagi all drew on Bacchic symbols. Instruments of ecstatic worship, ritual containers, sacred baskets, serpents, and scenes of initiation all began to appear in funerary settings. Not every grave decorated with Dionysiac imagery belonged to an initiate, and not every image can be read as a direct statement of faith. Still, it is remarkable that the cult of Dionysus became such a rich visual language for confronting death, grief, and the hope for something better beyond them. In some cases, rituals connected to Dionysus were even performed near tombs, or in memory of the dead within religious groups devoted to him. Mourning and ecstasy seem to have met at the same point. Yet even here, the promise of what came after death was rarely described in precise terms. It remained powerful because it was suggestive rather than exact. It offered an answer without fully explaining the shape of that answer. Fear of death was not a theoretical problem in antiquity. It was a constant human fact. As people drew closer to old age or faced sudden danger, anxieties emerged that may have remained hidden during calmer years. In that setting, rites of purification and initiation answered a very practical need. Many believed that sacred ceremonies could help them meet death with greater courage and perhaps secure brightness, peace, and celebration beyond the grave. This created a difficult but important question. How did these two sides of the mysteries fit together? On one side stood practical cures, ritual protection, emotional relief, and help in daily life. On the other stood the hope of posthumous joy. What held these dimensions together? It is not enough to say that ancient people simply projected agricultural symbols onto the human soul, or that the cycle of grain and wine naturally produced ideas of rebirth. Symbolism can support belief, but it does not by itself explain why belief becomes convincing. Another attractive theory says that all initiation rests on a drama of death and rebirth, so that ritual transformation becomes a rehearsal for overcoming real death. But the evidence from pagan mystery cults does not clearly support that idea. Ancient material does not strongly show a central doctrine of resurrection in the later religious sense. Nor is there much proof that initiation created a sharply defined new status that could then be directly extended into the next world. A more grounded answer may lie in the way ancient people understood suffering itself. Illness, mental distress, or repeated misfortune were often explained as the result of some old anger still at work, some unresolved offence connected with the dead. An ancestor, an improperly buried figure, a victim of violence, or another restless presence could be imagined as disturbing the living. In such a view, the world of the dead was not separate from daily life. Its tensions spilled over into human experience. Ritual then worked by calming these hostile forces, soothing grief, easing anger, and restoring harmony between the living and the dead. If the dead were appeased, the living could feel relief. In that sense, ceremonies that created joy, purification, or blessedness in the present also carried meaning for the next world. A person freed from ritual pollution and fear in this life could imagine the same state continuing after death. The living and the dead were linked through the same sacred action. This helps explain why mystery rites could promise both immediate relief and a better fate beyond the grave. It also explains why the dead are sometimes imagined as continuing the festival below. Those who refused ritual participation, by contrast, could be imagined as facing dark consequences. The threat and the promise belong to the same religious system. In this sense, what modern people might call magic stood very close to the roots of the mysteries. Yet this should not be misunderstood. Magic in the ancient world was not simply foolish superstition floating outside religion. It had a place within social life, within traditional explanations of suffering, and within systems of healing that many found meaningful. It could offer emotional relief, structure anxiety, and give a person a sense of action in the face of the unknown. For those who used it, it made sense. When attention shifts to the so-called Oriental cults, the picture changes again. In these traditions, concern for the afterlife is often less visible than expected. The worship of the Great Mother had early links with Dionysiac imagery, especially through shared ritual instruments and ecstatic symbolism. But in its later Roman form, this religion seems to have focused less on personal survival after death, and more on protection from disaster in the present. Some evidence hints at hopes for future blessedness, yet this is rare and far from central. Shared burials among devotees do appear in some cases, but they were not the rule. Images associated with Attis, especially mournful ones, may suggest themes of death and renewal, but their meaning for ordinary worshippers remains uncertain. They may express grief more than a confident doctrine of salvation. The Taurobolium, one of the most famous rites connected with this religious world, has often been treated as a dramatic symbol of rebirth. Yet the evidence point in a more practical direction. The rite appears to have been understood as effective for a limited period, after which it had to be repeated. That makes it look less like an absolute victory over death and more like a ritual means of maintaining protection and good fortune for a span of years. Later inscriptions using language of eternal rebirth are best understood in a different historical climate, one already shaped by the challenge of Christianity. In that setting, pagan language may have grown more absolute in response, borrowing tones that had become familiar from competing religious claims. The Egyptian gods present another complex case. The cult of Osiris was deeply tied to the dead in Egypt itself, and traces of that concern did travel outward. Prayers for refreshment after death and rites echoing burial symbolism appear beyond Egypt, including in the Roman world. Funerary monuments of priests and priestesses of Isis and related gods are widespread. Yet most of them seem more concerned with honour and memory than with clearly announcing a special fate in the next life. A few texts do speak more directly. Some suggest that service to Isis and participation in her secret rites secured passage not to darkness, but to a blessed destination. Even so, the language often blends Egyptian elements with familiar Greek ideas about the underworld. The most famous literary presentation of Isis shows the goddess speaking as a sovereign power who rules both the visible world and the realm below. She promises favour not only in life, but after death. Yet even there, the main force of the message lies in her power to shape destiny here and now. She is presented as the goddess who can delay ruin, redirect fate, and give renewed life within the world of the living. The promise beyond death is real, but it does not erase the strong focus on present existence. Human mortality remains a universal fact, and even the most devoted worshipper does not escape that truth. When the discussion finally reaches Mithras, the silence becomes especially striking. Later expectations have often assumed that Mithraism must have offered a grand vision of immortality, ascent through the cosmos, and final transcendence. Yet clear evidence for such beliefs is surprisingly thin. This is all the more notable because Iranian religious tradition contains strong ideas about the soul, judgment, and heavenly ascent. In the actual worship of Mithras, however, explicit statements of this kind are rare. Claims that Mithraists regularly practiced communal burial or formed a tightly closed brotherhood, focused on post-mortem salvation, do not hold up well against the evidence. Mithraic images do sometimes suggest elevation, movement, and cosmic symbolism. The figure of Mithras joined with the sun, God has invited many far-reaching interpretations. Some have imagined the initiate's soul rising through the spheres of the universe, yet the imagery itself does not prove a full escape from the cosmos into some higher world. The sun god moves through the heavens, but remains within the cosmic order. Any idea of a final breakthrough beyond it rests more on later philosophical interpretation than on firm evidence from the cult itself. Mithraism may instead have offered something different. Not escape from the world, but strength to endure it, to accept its violence, struggle, and sacrifice without giving in to despair. A revealing testimony comes from a later initiate who described Mithras not as the key to another universe, but as the source of steadiness in this one. The god is presented as an anchor in life and as a guide for the final journey when the time comes to depart. That promise is important, but it remains general. It offers hope rather than a detailed map of heaven. Once again, the strongest emphasis falls on secure living in the present world, not on a radical shift of religion toward obsession with death. That point becomes even clearer when pagan mystery cults are viewed beside Christianity. To pagan observers, Christianity could appear overwhelmingly centered on tombs, bodies, death, and the fate of the dead. The mysteries did not usually create that impression. They did not reject the pleasures of life. They did not glorify suffering for its own sake. They remained attached to joy, celebration, health, protection, and the attempt to live well in a fragile world. For that reason, the mysteries can seem, in a certain sense, more vulnerable and more human. A moving example survives in a funerary inscription for a child who died at 7 years old. His parents had already introduced him into several sacred roles and rites, dedicating him to multiple gods and giving him an honoured place in religious life. Yet when death still came, the inscription speaks not with certainty, but with grief and disillusionment. It says, in effect, that all these sacred things did not stop death. The sorrowing voice does not celebrate triumph over mortality. Instead, it recognizes the hard truth that fate cannot be undone. That text should not be treated as the whole story of the mysteries, but it is deeply revealing. The mystery cults did not offer a fixed and unquestionable doctrine that erased fear forever. They had no single gospel that guaranteed victory over death in every mind and every circumstance. Like votive religion, they remained experimental. They were shaped by hope, by repeated practice, by personal trust, and by the constant testing of divine power against human suffering. Sometimes they comforted. Sometimes they inspired. Sometimes they failed to satisfy. Their promises were real to those who embraced them, but they were never fully protected from disappointment. That tension is part of what makes these religions so compelling. They were not built on complete certainty. They lived in the space between fear and hope, between sickness and healing, between grief and festival, between the visible world and the unseen one beyond it. Their power came not from removing every doubt, but from giving people rituals, images, and promises strong enough to face life as it truly was. Unstable, dangerous, beautiful, and always shadowed by death. In many periods of history, religion was understood as a path to ultimate truth. Later generations treated it as a system of ideas that could be studied and classified. In more recent thought, religion has often been described as a way human beings create meaning in the world. Yet for the people who actually lived these traditions, religion was never only an abstract structure. It was tied to ordinary lives, to ambition and fear, to suffering and hope, to money, influence, and survival. Mystery cults belong to that same reality. They were not floating worlds of pure symbolism. They were sustained by real people who performed rituals, taught sacred practices, managed sanctuaries, organized initiations, and kept traditions alive over time. To understand them, it is necessary to ask who these people were, how they made their place in society, and how new members were drawn into their religious world. Once those questions are raised, one thing becomes immediately clear. Ancient mysteries did not form a single type of institution. Modern language sometimes makes them sound more unified than they really were. It is tempting to imagine them as organized communities resembling later churches, tightly structured groups with clear membership and stable internal authority. But that picture does not fit the evidence. Although the different mystery cults did have forms of social organization, none of them truly resembled a church in the later sense. Still less can they be treated as fully separate religions standing apart from the wider society around them. They remained connected to the city, the household, the sanctuary, and the shifting world of local custom. Three broad patterns of organization appear again and again. The first is the wandering ritual expert, the inspired specialist who travels from place to place offering purification, initiation, prophecy, or healing. The second is the resident priesthood attached to a sanctuary, more stable, more local, and often tied to an established sacred site. The third is the voluntary association of worshippers, a group formed by private individuals who gather around a common cult and maintain it together. These three forms often overlapped, but each had its own character and its own way of surviving. The wandering specialist is one of the oldest and most striking figures in this landscape. Such people appear early in Greek tradition as seers, priests, and ritual experts with unusual authority. They carried secret teachings, purification rites, and initiatory practices from one place to another. Their power often rested on a claim of inherited tradition. A master had passed sacred knowledge to a disciple, who then became the next link in a chain of transmission. This created a kind of spiritual family. A ritual expert did not simply invent his craft. He claimed to have received it from a predecessor, and that predecessor from another before him. In that sense, sacred knowledge moved through lineages, even when no blood relationship existed. Yet despite these claims of tradition, the wandering practitioner worked alone. He had no corporation to protect him, and no stable institution to support him. He depended on persuasion, reputation, and demand. At times, such a figure could become highly successful, especially in crisis, when war, plague, or social unrest made people desperate for divine help. More often, this was a precarious life lived at the edge of respectability, exposed to suspicion, mockery, and poverty. A second model appears in the sanctuary priesthood. This pattern was especially important in Egypt and the Near East, though it could also be seen elsewhere. Here, the religious specialist was not a traveller, but a fixed presence, rooted in a particular holy place. A sanctuary could attract pilgrims, offerings, sacrifices, and requests for healing or divine guidance. If the site became famous enough, it could grow into a successful and wealthy institution. Priests in such places did not move through society like independent craftsmen. They belonged to a local hierarchy and often had to work within an established administrative framework. But in return they gained security, prestige, and continuity. Their authority came from the sanctuary itself, from its traditions, its rituals, and its reputation. In this form, religion could become a lasting enterprise with buildings, property, and a regular flow of income. The third model was the association or religious club. This type was especially common in the Greek and Roman world. Individuals joined together not because they had abandoned family, city, or profession, but because they shared a devotional interest. They remained part of ordinary social life, yet they devoted time, money, and energy to a common religious cause. Wealthy members often supported the group and in return received honor, status, and public recognition. These associations had meeting places, legal standing, and sometimes shared property. But they usually lacked a rigid hierarchy or a single dominant leader. Their cohesion came from common activity rather than strict obedience. This form of organization was flexible, social, and durable, and it became one of the most visible ways mystery cults survived in cities across the Mediterranean. These three patterns could connect in many ways. A wandering expert might gather a circle of followers around himself. A sanctuary priest might also develop a charismatic reputation that reached beyond his own temple. A private association might attach itself closely to a sanctuary or recruit a ritual specialist to lead its ceremonies. Yet none of these links was absolutely necessary. Each type could exist on its own, and often did. In the earlier history of mysteries associated with Dionysus and the mother goddess, the wandering practitioner seems especially important. One revealing example comes from the Hellenistic world, where ritual experts connected with Dionysus were ordered to register their credentials and identify the line of sacred transmission through which they had received their rites. What mattered was not only performance, but ancestry of a spiritual kind. Each officiant had to show from whom the sacred knowledge had come, reaching back through several generations. This confirms that such traditions were treated almost like inherited crafts. They also possessed sacred texts or ritual narratives, which were kept and transmitted as part of the initiatory heritage. The same pattern appears in stories about the spread of Bacchic rites in Italy. Accounts describe foreign ritual specialists carrying initiations into new regions, where the rites gradually took root and changed under local influence. Individual priestesses or visionaries could gain strong authority by claiming direct inspiration from the god and introducing new elements into the tradition. This is exactly the kind of religious expansion one would expect in a world where charismatic authority mattered as much as inherited ritual. In literature too, the Dionysiac stranger appears as a bringer of secret rites, a figure from outside who arrives with divine power, initiatory knowledge, and the ability to overturn the established order. In some cities, female initiators of Dionysus are explicitly mentioned. In others, family lines of seers and ritual experts seem to have adapted older traditions to new social conditions, using initiation rites as a source of livelihood. This may explain how certain sacred formulas, burial texts, and ritual instructions spread across distant regions over a long period of time. They were likely carried not by centralized institutions, but by networks of mobile, religious craftsmen, each preserving and reshaping a shared tradition. After the suppression of the Bacchic scandal at Rome in the 2nd century before Christ, the role of the wandering Bacchic initiator seems to fade sharply, at least in the surviving evidence. Yet the mysteries of Dionysus did not disappear. They re-emerge later in inscriptions, art, and ritual life throughout the Roman world. From that point forward, more organized associations become easier to see. Dionysiac groups often formed around wealthy patrons, urban cult centers, or private houses. Their internal structure remains difficult to reconstruct, and much is hidden behind images, ritual symbols, and literary echoes. Still, it is clear that the cult adapted. It survived not by relying only on roaming specialists, but by embedding itself in local groups and durable social settings. One remarkable case shows a city deliberately importing sacred authority from elsewhere. A group of women descended, according to tradition, from the earliest attendants of Dionysus were invited to establish proper rites in a new location. Here again, legitimacy came through lineage. But unlike the solitary wandering expert, this was a sacred nucleus of multiple persons, bearers of divine power as a group, capable of founding a new devotional circle through their presence alone. Such episodes reveal how mystery cults combine tradition, charisma, and collective identity in fluid but powerful ways. The cult of the Mother Goddess followed a somewhat similar path in its Greek phase. Early evidence points to wandering specialists who spread her worship while making a living from ecstatic ritual performance. These figures were often viewed with contempt by respectable society. Comic poets and political rivals used their name as an insult. They were noisy, emotionally intense, and associated with cymbals, drums, and ecstatic possession. Yet despite mockery, they clearly played an important role in carrying the goddess's worship across the Greek world. Shrines and votive monuments connected to her appear widely and early, suggesting that these religious mediators were far more effective than elite opinion would admit. Over time, however, the form of organization that gave the cult of the Mother Goddess real strength and prestige was the sanctuary. The great centre at Pessinus in Anatolia developed into a place of exceptional importance. Its traditions reached far back, and its priesthood was marked by the striking presence of eunuch priests. This sanctuary proved capable not only of preserving old ritual forms, but of negotiating with political powers and adapting to changing historical circumstances. When Rome sought to bring the goddess into its own religious system during a time of crisis, the sanctuary responded, and the cult took on a new and far more influential life in the Roman capital. From that point onward, important centres of her worship grew in Rome and elsewhere, supported by sanctuaries, priestly offices, and linked ritual institutions. The special clergy of this cult remained distinctive. The eunuch priests, marked permanently by devotion to the goddess, performed acts of extreme religious intensity that inspired both fear and fascination. Their way of life was highly visible and impossible to reverse. Once entered, it could not simply be abandoned. This gave the cult a charismatic core of extraordinary commitment. Around this core, more conventional forms of organization developed. Roman officials supervised aspects of the system. Civic approval became necessary for appointments, and respectable religious associations grew up alongside the ecstatic clergy. In places such as Ostia, archaeology reveals an entire sacred complex structured around these different layers of participation. The result was a religion that joined terrifying charisma with bureaucracy, public ceremony, and organized group life. Eleusis stands apart from both Dionysiac and Meter traditions because it never truly expanded beyond its own sacred location. The worship of Demeter spread widely, and forms of reverence linked to Eleusinian themes appeared in many regions, especially in the Greek East. But the mysteries themselves remained tied to the one place chosen by the goddess in myth and ritual memory. Their authority rested on that exclusiveness. Eleusis did not send out roaming initiators to establish equal branches elsewhere. Instead, it built prestige through uniqueness. Its internal structure was highly developed and unusually stable. Two old aristocratic families shared the major priestly roles. One supplied the chief sacred official, while the other held important secondary offices connected with torch-bearing and sacred proclamation. Members of these lineages retained the privilege of performing initiation, and their authority was rooted in hereditary sacred knowledge. At the same time, the Athenian state built an official framework around the mysteries. Civic magistrates oversaw aspects of administration and finance, ensuring that the sanctuary's fame was balanced by public control. This combination of inherited priesthood and state supervision gave Eleusis an institutional solidity, unlike that of more fluid mystery traditions. Its influence, however, spread far beyond Attica through prestige, poetry, art, and symbolism, rather than through replication of the rite itself. Eleusinian imagery appears across the Greek world and beyond, reaching as far as southern Russia, Italy, and Egypt. Rulers and elite patrons borrowed its symbols for political and personal display. There were even cases in which figures connected with Eleusis acted elsewhere in ways that suggest a wider religious role. A member of an Eleusinian priestly family could advise on foreign cults or help shape the presentation of other gods. Yet this did not amount to the export of Eleusis as an institution. The centre remained singular. Alexandria offers a fascinating case because elements connected with Demeter, Cora, and sacred revelation appear there in forms that resemble Eleusinian themes. Some festivals in Egypt presented divine birth, revelation, and sacred spectacle in ways that recall Greek mystery patterns. Yet these rites belong to a different religious setting. They were not simply copies of Eleusis. The old sanctuary in Attica preserved its unique status by refusing duplication, and in that refusal lay much of its lasting authority. In this wider landscape, Dionysiac mysteries may at times have functioned as a kind of alternative in places far from Eleusis. They could provide ecstatic ritual, sacred secrecy, communal identity, and hope beyond ordinary civic cult, without depending on one exclusive sanctuary. Their flexibility may have made them especially powerful in regions where Eleusinian prestige was admired, but direct access was impossible. Among all the mystery traditions of the ancient Mediterranean, the cult of Isis presents one of the most layered and difficult pictures to untangle. Its structure was not built on a single pattern. It carried with it the weight of ancient Egyptian temple religion, yet it also adapted to Greek and Roman expectations in ways that changed how outsiders understood it. At the center of the Egyptian religious system stood a basic idea that shaped everything else. The god was not only honored in image, but truly present in the sacred statue. That presence required a proper dwelling, which meant a temple, daily ritual attention, and a permanent staff of priests and attendants. In Egypt, this had always been the normal form of worship. Priests of different rank served the god through an organized routine that lasted from morning until night. And the temple was not just a place of occasional devotion, but a living house of the divine. When Egyptian cults moved into the Greek world, they brought this temple model with them. One of the clearest cases shows an Egyptian priestly family arriving abroad while carrying the image of the god itself. At first, the sacred presence had to be kept in temporary lodging, waiting until a proper shrine could be established. Eventually, a sanctuary was built in a contested urban space, and the god's house took permanent form. What had begun as a private initiative then developed into something larger and more official, eventually coming under civic supervision. This pattern helps explain how the cult of Serapis and Isis spread outside Egypt. The starting point was often not a public decree or a missionary movement in the later sense, but the arrival of Egyptians who brought their gods with them and created a sacred center around them. From there, wealth accumulated through offerings and local structures formed around the temple. Yet the Egyptian temple alone was not enough to explain what happened in the wider Mediterranean. Around these sanctuaries, Greek-style associations of worshippers began to grow. Devotees organized themselves into named groups, creating a circle of participants beyond the resident clergy. In cities such as Rome and Pompeii, the cult moved from fragile beginnings and political suspicion to impressive public success. There were periods when Roman authorities repeatedly tried to suppress it, destroying altars and resisting its spread. But the attraction of Isis proved stronger than official hostility. In time, magnificent temples rose in the heart of the capital, and the cult gained a secure place in urban life. One reason for the resilience of the Egyptian gods was the strong authority claimed by their clergy. The priests insisted that the rites had to be performed according to ancestral custom, in the proper Egyptian way. This meant that actual Egyptians, or at least people recognized as bearers of authentic Egyptian knowledge, were needed in the sanctuary. They handled sacred water linked to the Nile, used ritual books marked by ancient prestige, and followed a pattern of worship that was far more continuous and elaborate than most Greek temple practice. From dawn until night, the gods were awakened, washed, clothed, nourished, honored, and finally put to rest again. These daily acts created a world of divine intimacy and temple discipline that felt ancient, foreign, and powerful all at once. Alongside the daily service stood the great public festivals, with their processions, costumes, sacred objects, and dramatic display. These occasions made the presence of the Egyptian gods visible to the wider city. The clergy also promoted the cult with great skill. Every healing, every rescue, every sign of divine favor could become part of the temple's reputation. Stories of miracles and answered prayers spread devotion and increased trust in the gods. At the same time, more layers of participation appeared around the priesthood. There were organized groups associated with carrying sacred items, wearing distinctive garments, or taking part in processions. Linen clothing and shaved heads became especially recognizable signs of attachment to the cult. Literature often describes the Egyptian sanctuary as filled with white garments, polished ritual order, and a crowd visibly marked by its closeness to the gods. There were also many worshippers who held no rank at all. Some were simple devotees with no official role, while others tried to live as close as possible to the sanctuary, renting rooms nearby or even within the sacred precinct if they could afford it. The temple became not only a place of ritual, but a social center, a place where the divine was believed to dwell, and where a person might remain near that presence for comfort, healing, or advancement. This wider environment is essential for understanding the mysteries of Isis, because the initiations themselves were never the whole cult. They were one part of a much broader religious world. That is where the real difficulty begins. The mystery rites of Isis are famous in later imagination, but solid evidence for them outside one major literary account is surprisingly limited. Inscriptions referring clearly to initiates are rare. Images that suggest secrecy and sacred revelation do appear, and there are hints that some worshippers belong to the god in a more intimate or elevated sense than ordinary participants. But the record is thin enough to make it difficult to reconstruct a firm initiatory system from documents alone. A few terms suggest special consecration. A few scattered signs point to people who stood closer to the god than the ordinary crowd. Yet the exact line between simple devotion, temple service, and mystery initiation remains uncertain. One literary narrative offers the most vivid portrait. There, a man first becomes an ordinary devotee living near the sanctuary, awaiting divine favor and readiness. Only later does he pass through costly and repeated initiations, first to Isis and then to Osiris, before finally entering a more honored place within the temple structure. This suggests that initiation could serve as a step between general worship and fuller religious status. But there is no reason to assume that every sanctuary followed a neat sequence, or that such advancement was always required. The mysteries were probably offered selectively, and not as the universal center of Isiac religion. A deeper misunderstanding lay behind the very rise of these rites. Greek observers had long looked at Egypt and seen in it the homeland of ancient sacred secrecy. The night rituals of Osiris, The lamentation, the priestly hierarchy, and the aura of hidden knowledge all encouraged the Greek imagination to interpret Egyptian religion through the language of mysteries. In reality, Egyptian temples had their own initiations and restricted rituals for priests, but not the same public access mystery structure found in Greek cults, such as Eleusis. Yet to Greek eyes, Egypt seemed older, deeper, and more original. It was easy to believe that the famous mystery traditions of Greece had their roots there. This idea became part of the prestige of Isis herself. In time, the propaganda of the Isiac cult embraced that perception. Texts praising the goddess began to present her not merely as a benefactor or healer, but as the source of mysteries throughout the world. In some versions, she is linked directly or indirectly to the most famous sacred rites of Greece. The effect of this claim was powerful. It suggested that behind well-known Greek mysteries there existed something even more ancient and more authentic in Egypt itself. Such ambiguity created desire. Worshippers could imagine that initiation into Isis offered access to something at once foreign, venerable, secret, and especially effective. As a result, sanctuaries of Isis appear to have developed forms of personal initiation designed to meet that demand. These rites were shaped by Greek expectations of mystery religion, but expressed through Egyptian ritual language, imagery, and divine drama. They were not the original core of Egyptian worship, but they became a specialized service within the larger cult. They were expensive, time-consuming, and probably rare. Only a fortunate minority could pursue them fully. Most devotees would remain part of the larger religious life of the sanctuary, joining festivals, prayers, processions, and acts of devotion without ever reaching that level of intimacy. The mysteries of Isis were therefore not the foundation of the cult, but one carefully adapted part of a much more complex religious system, serving those who sought a deeper personal bond and had the means to obtain it. If the world of Isis was layered, public, and temple-centered, the world of Mithras looked almost entirely different. Here, there were no wandering holy men spreading the rites in open view, no large public associations moving through the city in processions, and no monumental priesthood on display before the crowd. The center of Mithraic worship was the secret meeting place itself, the cave-like sanctuary where initiation and group ritual took place away from public observation. Everything in this cult seems to point towards small, enclosed groups bound together by ritual secrecy. That makes Mithraism stand apart sharply from the other mysteries. In some ways, it resembles the broader anthropological model of male secret societies more than the familiar Greek pattern of open sanctuary and festival. Its secrecy appears to have been unusually strict. The archaeological remains are rich, but literary testimony is sparse. That contrast is striking. While some cults left abundant discussion in texts, Mithras left mostly spaces, images, and inscriptions. The shrines themselves were usually small, often large enough for only a few dozen participants at most. This was not the architecture of a mass religion. When membership increased, the response was not usually to enlarge the existing sanctuary into a major public temple, but to establish another cave elsewhere. Inside those caves, the organization was not divided between professional clergy and general worshippers in the way seen with Isis. Instead, Mithraism was structured through a strict ladder of initiation grades. There were 7 of them, and advancement through them gave the cult a powerful internal hierarchy. Authority rested especially in the highest rank, the fathers, who seemed to have supervised the correctness of the rites and played a key role whenever a new sanctuary was founded. To establish a new Mithraic group, a figure of recognized status had to be present. This suggests a controlled and disciplined network, even without any broad public institution. The system also explains the remarkable consistency of Mithraic sanctuaries and imagery across a vast geographic space. From western frontiers to eastern outposts, the same visual program, the same ritual world, and the same graded identity appear again and again. This kind of uniformity could only exist because the cult was carefully transmitted through people who understood themselves as guardians of the right. Soldiers and merchants seem to have been especially important in this process. The mobility of the Roman army in particular gave Mithraism one of its main channels of expansion. Devoted individuals with money and influence could found new sanctuaries, but they did so within a tradition that remained tightly controlled. One notable feature of Mithraism was the combination of select inclusion and strict exclusion. Slaves could be admitted, though likely only after close scrutiny. Women, however, were excluded altogether. This makes Mithraism unique among the major mystery cults of the ancient world and strengthens the impression that it functioned as a highly structured men's society. Participation brought access to a hidden and disciplined group, not to a broad public movement. Once this social background becomes visible, a larger question comes into focus. Did mystery cults actually create communities in the strong sense of the word? Did they form enduring religious bodies comparable to churches, with shared identity, long-term cohesion, and a clear line between insiders and outsiders? The answer depends heavily on which type of cult is being considered. One important fact, however, stands out immediately. Some mysteries did not produce permanent communities at all. This is especially true when the ritual depended on the wandering charismatic. A mobile expert might arrive, perform initiations or cures, gather a temporary group of participants, and then move on again. Those who had undergone the ritual might feel healed, protected, or transformed, but they did not necessarily remain joined in any stable organization. They carried with them certain teachings, perhaps certain rules for conduct or certain ritual memories, but not membership in a lasting body. Their bond was real, yet brief. Even so, the experience of gathering mattered. Initiation often meant entering a joyful circle, a sacred chorus, a group celebration whose emotional power was part of the cure itself. The shared dance, the ecstatic procession, the ritual music, the night ceremony, the common vision, all of this created temporary unity and deep impression. People who had suffered separately came together, found relief together, and then dispersed again. The group existed intensely for the duration of the rite or the festival, but not necessarily afterward. In such cases, the real unity was not organizational or doctrinal. It was experiential. Eleusis shows this particularly well. Thousands could gather for the mysteries, sharing one of the most powerful sacred events in the Greek world. But after the festival, they returned to ordinary civic life. The initiate was changed in memory and perhaps in outlook, yet not removed from the everyday structures of family and city. Even the possibility of returning in a later year for a higher stage of participation did not create a permanent religious corporation. What lasted was the memory of a sacred event, not a separate communal existence. The clergy of a sanctuary did form a real community, but of a limited and closed kind. Priests and attendants lived together under shared ritual discipline, common interest, and institutional continuity. Yet they depended on outsiders. They needed worshippers to visit, donate, sacrifice, and seek the gods. Their group could not expand indefinitely without undermining its own support. For that reason, temple clergy were never likely to become a fully self-contained alternative society. Their livelihood required a relationship with the wider world. That leaves the Thiassos, the club-like association, as the strongest candidate for a true mystery community. These groups could last across generations. Their members shared meals, rituals, processions, funerary obligations, and acts of mutual loyalty. Wealthy supporters gave money and received honor in return. Members recognized each other as fellow initiates and sometimes felt deep attachment through that shared status. Dedications could be made not only to the god, but to the fellow initiates as well, showing that the bond within the group had emotional and social force. Still, even these associations remained limited. They were not charitable communities for the poor, nor societies built on equality of condition. They existed within the competitive social world of the city, and honor was one of their strongest motives. Members remained economically independent, with their own property, occupations, and private aims. Joining such a group was a personal decision, and in most cases, leaving it posed no fundamental crisis of identity. This is an important difference from later religious models in which departure could mean exclusion from an entire social and spiritual world. The language of brotherhood does occasionally appear among initiates, even in contexts as prestigious as Eleusis. Shared initiation could create a kind of symbolic kinship. Hospitality, friendship, and mutual recognition could develop through common participation in sacred rites. Initiates may have known signs or tokens by which they recognize one another, and that could create familiarity even among strangers. Yet such ties did not erase the exclusiveness of these groups. Membership was often restricted, and large-scale expansion was not the rule. Even associations devoted to the same god in different places do not seem to have maintained strong, regular contact with each other. This localism mattered. A devotee moving from one city to another might seek out a familiar cult, but even then he could find that previous initiations did not automatically count. A new initiation might be demanded, a new stage entered, a new local pattern respected. Religious life in the Greek and Roman world was profoundly local and departmental. Cult groups were attached to places, offices, and particular ritual frameworks. They did not function like branches of one worldwide institution. Above all, secrecy placed a limit on expansion. The attraction of the mysteries depended partly on the fact that not everyone knew what happened inside them. The core experience was hidden, guarded, and withheld. That secrecy created fascination, but it also prevented the formation of a public and universal body of believers. The goal was not to spread an openly declared creed to all humanity. The goal was to preserve the distinction between those who had entered and those who had not. This leads directly to the question of religious identity. Did an initiate think of himself in the same clear way that a Christian later could, with a defined sense of belonging that set him apart from others? Mystery cults do seem to have encouraged remembrance. Initiates were expected to recall what they had undergone. They learned signs, formulas, and tokens connected to the rite. Some may have kept sacred objects as reminders of their passage. But this is still very different from belonging to a religion defined by a public confession of faith. In Christianity, identity came to rest on belief that could be stated, taught, defended, and confessed aloud. In the mysteries, by contrast, what mattered was not a list of propositions, but a sequence of actions experienced. The initiate remembered not a doctrine to be repeated, but a ritual through which he had passed. That distinction is crucial. Whatever identity mystery cults offered was rooted in performance, memory, atmosphere, and symbolic recognition, not in formal theology. Ritual did the work that doctrine would do elsewhere. Its power did not depend on a clearly expressed system of belief. And there is no convincing sign that the ancient mysteries were held together by anything resembling a fixed creed. That is why the mystery cults remained both powerful and limited. They could create loyalty without becoming churches. They could transform experience without producing a universal confession. They could gather people into circles of secrecy, devotion, and mutual recognition without dissolving the older structures of city, family, and social rank. In that tension lies much of their fascination. They were deeply meaningful, socially real, and often emotionally intense, yet they never became the kind of total religious identity that later ages would take for granted. People often speak about mystery cults as if they must have possessed a deep and fully developed theology, something close to the dense religious writing later preserved in Judaism and Christianity. But when the surviving evidence is examined, that expectation quickly runs into a problem. The written world of the pagan mysteries is surprisingly thin. There is nothing like the massive body of doctrinal literature that later religious traditions produced. No great shelf of mystery scriptures survives, and there is no reason to think such a library ever truly existed in the same form. This absence has long encouraged scholars to search elsewhere, hoping to reconstruct the lost thought of the mysteries from indirect sources that seem to move in the same atmosphere. Three kinds of material have often been drawn into that search. The first is the ancient romance, especially those narratives that include scenes of sacred ritual, strange transformations, divine rescue, and initiation. The second is the body of Gnostic and Hermetic writings, which speak constantly in the language of hidden truths, revelation, and sacred ascent. The third is the world of magical papyri, filled with ritual instructions, invocations, and attempts to contact divine powers through highly charged ceremonial acts. All three seem promising at first glance. All three contain imagery that feels close to the world of mystery religion. Yet each becomes more difficult the closer it is examined. Ancient romances are a good example. Some of them clearly use patterns that resemble initiation. A character passes through danger, confusion, symbolic death, recognition, and finally, some form of revelation or restoration. Religious rituals appear in these stories in vivid and memorable ways, sometimes more vividly than in many other surviving texts. But that does not automatically make the romances secret manuals of the mysteries. Much of what appears in them may simply be literary colour, a way of making the story more dramatic, more emotional, or more impressive to an audience already familiar with sacred imagery. Even when a romance ends with a scene of initiation, it does not follow that the entire narrative should be read as a coded religious program. In many cases, the structure of initiation may belong to storytelling itself as much as to any particular cult. Myths, folk tales, and adventure stories often follow similar patterns without being direct expressions of mystery religion. So while romances preserve valuable details and help illuminate the religious imagination of the age, they cannot serve as a reliable key to unlock the theology of the mysteries. The same caution applies to Gnostic and Hermetic texts. These writings are full of the language of hidden knowledge, ascent, revelation, and sacred transformation. Because of that, they once seemed to offer a path back to the spiritual world of pagan mystery religion. But the closer these texts are studied, the less simple that connection appears. Their ideas are filtered through a very different religious environment, shaped strongly by Jewish and Christian thought as well as by philosophy. Even if some of their themes overlap with older pagan material, they belong to a world that is already moving in a new direction. The words for mystery and secrecy appear constantly in these writings, but so often and so broadly that their meaning begins to loosen. In many passages, the language is metaphorical rather than ritual. It speaks less about an actual initiation performed in a sanctuary than about a spiritual process, an inner awakening, or a hidden truth expressed in symbolic form. What was once a carefully balanced ritual world becomes something much more expansive, speculative, and unstable. For that reason, these texts may preserve echoes of older religious habits, but they do not offer a clear window into the working structure of pagan mysteries as they were actually practiced. The magical papyri pose a different challenge. Their importance for the study of ancient religion is undeniable. They preserve an extraordinary range of ritual techniques, invocations, cosmic imagery, and direct interaction with divine powers. Some of them even describe visionary journeys, heavenly ascent, or encounters with great gods in language so dramatic that it has tempted readers to connect them with initiation rites. Yet here too the resemblance can mislead. These texts usually describe private operations, not communal ceremonies. They are aimed at obtaining specific results such as knowledge, protection, influence, erotic control, or access to hidden forces. Their world is intensely practical, often solitary, and highly technical. That makes them quite different from the shared experience of a mystery festival, where the initiate entered a group, a ritual setting, and a sacred sequence shaped by collective emotion and inherited form. Magic and mystery were never entirely separate in the ancient world. They touched one another at many points. Both could involve sacred speech, ritual purity, divine names, symbolic actions, and the guidance of specialists. Certain myths and ritual patterns even appear in both fields. Some individuals clearly moved between the two worlds with ease, but overlap does not mean identity. The magician typically worked alone or for a private client, seeking a narrowly defined result. The mystery cult, even when deeply personal, still drew its force from shared celebration, collective symbols, and a ceremonial setting larger than the individual. In the magical texts, the focus often falls on gaining control over specific outcomes. In the mysteries, the experience is broader and more communal, even when it remains secret. That is why it is difficult to extract full liturgies of mystery, cults from the magical material. The overlap is real, but not complete enough to collapse one into the other. At this point, a deeper possibility has to be considered. Perhaps the search for a large written theology of the mysteries is misguided from the start. Perhaps the reason it has not been found is not simply bad luck or the loss of manuscripts, but the nature of the mysteries themselves. They were often described as unspeakable. That word can mean deliberate secrecy, a refusal to reveal what outsiders were not allowed to hear. But it can also suggest something more fundamental. What mattered most in the mysteries may not have been easily captured in ordinary words at all. The heart of the experience may have been something enacted, suffered, witnessed, and felt rather than stated as a doctrine. Ancient testimony points strongly in that direction. The initiate was not expected only to learn information, but to undergo an experience. The rite worked through atmosphere, sequence, surprise, fear, relief, vision, and emotional transformation. It was not only a lesson, but an event. In that sense, the mysteries were not primarily systems of theology arranged for careful reading. They were rituals that acted upon the participant. The deepest meaning was carried by performance. That helps explain why later observers often struggle to describe them. What was central did not rest in a set of propositions that could simply be repeated outside the sanctuary. Yet this does not mean that words had no place in the mysteries. That would go too far. Ancient rites were not mute performances emptied of speech or explanation. There is clear evidence that initiates received instruction, preparation, and transmission before reaching the highest moment of the ritual. Sacred speech mattered. There were things to be taught, things to be recited, things to be heard, and things to be remembered. If secrecy was taken so seriously, that alone suggests that words formed an important part of the process. One does not guard silence so fiercely unless speech has power within it. Mystery cults were often assumed to possess sacred narratives, special accounts of the gods, the rites, and the truths revealed through them. These could be spoken aloud, transmitted by a teacher, or in some cases, possibly preserved in written form. Initiates were not entering a blank, emotional exercise. They were being introduced to a sacred framework, to a story or pattern that gave the ritual its shape and meaning. In this sense, the mysteries did include teaching. A participant was expected to come away knowing more than before, especially about the gods, their hidden aspects, their powers, their identities, and the meaning of certain sacred acts. There was, in other words, a theology of some kind. But it was not theology in the later sense of a large, formal system, worked out through books and debates. It was embedded in ritual, speech, and symbolic action. That distinction matters. Later, religious traditions often built their authority on doctrine, clearly stated and publicly defended. The mystery cults appear to have functioned differently. Their knowledge was not absent, but it was inseparable from performance. The sacred tale did not stand apart from the rite as a neutral text to be studied in isolation. It lived inside the ceremony, inside the gestures, the objects, the sequence, the emotional movement, and the controlled revelation of what the initiate was finally allowed to see and hear. Learning and experience belonged together. The words prepared the mind, but the ritual completed the truth in a different register. Philosophical writers help confirm this balance. Some ancient thinkers described the mysteries as a process that went beyond simple learning and culminated in a state of direct apprehension. Yet even there, the highest experience did not eliminate preparation. It came only after earlier stages had made the participant ready. The final vision might surpass speech, but it did not appear from nowhere. It rested on discipline, instruction, and ritual order. That means the mysteries should not be reduced either to pure doctrine or to pure feeling. They operated through both, though not in equal form. This is why the phrase mystery theology can easily mislead if it is understood too literally. It is useful only if theology is taken in a broad sense, as a sacred understanding of the gods conveyed through ritual speech, symbolic narrative, and transformative ceremony. It becomes misleading if it suggests that somewhere there must once have been full sets of mystery books, explaining everything in a clear and systematic way. The evidence points instead to a world in which the most important truths were mediated by action, not by abstract exposition alone. Seen this way, the silence surrounding the mysteries begins to make more sense. It was not merely the silence of missing texts. It was the silence of a religious form that never relied completely on texts in the first place. The initiate was not simply handed a doctrine. The initiate was led through a process. Something was heard, something was shown, something was done, and something was felt. Only by passing through all of that, together could the full meaning emerge. Written texts played a role in mystery traditions far earlier than many people assume. Sacred rites were not passed down only by memory, gesture, and spoken performance. In some cases, books were clearly part of the ceremony itself. One ancient example describes a young assistant reading from ritual texts, while his mother carried out initiations. That image captures something important about these cults. However secret the rites may have been, they were not always wordless. A written guide, a sacred narrative, or a ritual script could stand close to the center of the performance, helping preserve the order of the ceremony and the authority of those who performed it. There is direct evidence that initiation priests in certain Dionysiac traditions kept written sacred accounts. In one royal measure from the Hellenistic age, these ritual specialists were ordered to submit their sacred texts in sealed form to the authorities. That detail is revealing. The government was not dealing with vague rumour or private improvisation. It assumed that the officiants possessed definite texts, written documents that could be inspected if suspicion fell upon them. The state wanted access to the hidden teachings because it understood that the written word could preserve the inner structure of the cult. The secrecy of the mysteries therefore did not exclude books. In some cases it depended on them. Something similar appears in another case where an older local initiation tradition was restored and legitimized by means of a written object discovered from the earth itself. The sacred text was treated almost as a buried guarantee of continuity, proof that the rite was ancient, authentic, and worthy of revival. Once recovered, it was preserved among the treasures of the sanctuary. This shows that writing could serve more than one purpose. It could guide ritual action, but it could also anchor tradition, giving visible form to claims of antiquity and sacred authority. Egyptian cults provide another angle on the same pattern. In sanctuaries of Isis and related gods, sacred books from Egypt were displayed as part of the religious setting. Their presence added prestige, depth, and a sense of ancient wisdom. They linked the local temple to a much older civilization and suggested that the rites being performed stood on the foundation of venerable knowledge. Yet even here, the actual place of books within daily religious life seems to have varied. In some cults, texts stood more visibly at the forefront. In others, tradition may have been preserved more through family transmission, priestly memory, or ritual habit than through a rich literary collection. This becomes especially striking in the case of Mithras. A few images suggest figures holding or consulting books, but the surviving evidence does not point to a broad literary culture surrounding the cult in the western provinces. The inscriptions associated with Mithraic worship are often clumsy and uneven, which suggests that many participants were not closely tied to elite literary circles. Whatever teaching Mithraism transmitted, it seems to have done so mainly through ritual structure, visual symbolism, and hierarchical initiation, rather than through an elaborate culture of written theology. The same may be said, in a different way, of Eleusis and the cult of the mother goddess. There was tradition, there were records, and there was priestly continuity. But there is no sign of a great theological library standing behind the rites. One of the most fascinating fragments of a mystery text comes from a damaged papyrus that preserves a mixture of invocations, prayers, ritual directions, and short formulas. The surviving lines are broken, but even in fragmentary condition, the structure is recognizable. The text moves back and forth between calling upon divine powers and instructing the performer what to do. This is not abstract theology in the later sense. It is practical, liturgical, and closely tied to action. Names associated with Bacchic and Orphic religion appear within it, along with ritual details linked to the mythic world of Dionysus. The result feels less like philosophical speculation and more like a working ritual document, something intended to be used rather than merely read. Other surviving materials from later Egyptian religion show a similarly difficult mixture of oath, formula, and obscurity. The language is often so compressed and enigmatic that modern interpretation remains uncertain. But even this uncertainty teaches something. Sacred writing in the mysteries was not designed for open explanation. It could be elusive, coded, and incomplete outside its ritual setting. A text might make full sense only to those already instructed in the ceremony, already familiar with the objects, actions, and hidden narrative to which it referred. Ancient authorities trying to suppress suspicious religious practices knew very well that books mattered. When Roman officials moved against new and troubling forms of worship during wartime anxiety, they confiscated collections of religious writings. These were not philosophical treatises. They included prophetic texts, prayer books, and written instructions for sacrifice. To this list should be added the sacred narrative or ritual account preserved by initiatory groups. Such evidence gives a clearer picture of the written world surrounding these cults. It was not mainly a world of systematic doctrine. It was a world of ritual manuals, prayers, sacrificial prescriptions, sacred tales, and practical texts used in performance. Even famous philosophical criticism confirms this. When private ritual experts are mocked for conducting initiations with books attributed to ancient sacred authorities, the point is not that they are theologians in the later sense. The point is that they possess texts that guide what they do. Their books authorize sacrifice, ritual handling, and sacred speech. In such a setting, the line between sacred narrative and ritual instruction could be very thin. A sacred account might itself function as a guide for action, while ritual directions might carry within them pieces of myth and hidden meaning. Still, the existence of books should not create the illusion that these religions were text-based in the same sense as later scriptural faiths. There is no sign that sacred writing served as the single, fixed foundation of pagan mystery religion in the way the Torah, the Bible, or the Quran would later define the center of entire religious worlds. The books used in mysteries were important, but they did not stand above ritual as a supreme and final authority. They were part of a larger process in which practice came first. An explanation followed in multiple possible directions. A revealing ancient reflection makes exactly this point. It distinguishes between religious specialists who simply perform rites and those who also care to explain what they are doing. That contrast matters. It implies that ritual can exist and function without any elaborate account attached to it. A priest or priestess may know how to carry out the ceremony correctly through inherited practice alone. The rite works because it is done, not because its meaning has been fully clarified in advance. At the same time, some religious figures did seek to provide an explanation. They wanted a reasoned account that could make the action intelligible. Yet such explanations were not fixed once and for all. They were not guarded by a doctrinal institution capable of enforcing one official interpretation. Another ancient critic of private mysteries complains that ritual specialists take people's money without bringing them to true understanding. According to this complaint, the participants remain confused, too intimidated even to ask questions, and leave with neither knowledge nor clarity. The criticism is harsh, but it reveals something important. It shows that mystery rites existed in an environment where people expected more than performance alone. There was a desire for understanding, for some deeper explanation of what the rites meant. This desire opened the door for intellectuals, philosophers, and speculative interpreters to step in and offer their own readings. In that way, mystery traditions generated not only their own internal forms of sacred speech, but also external layers of interpretation, added by those who stood at the edge of the rites and wanted to explain them. From what can be reconstructed, these attempts to explain the mysteries moved on three main levels. The first was myth. The second was allegory built around nature. The third was metaphysical speculation. These levels did not replace one another in a clean sequence. The newer ones were added on top of the older, so that the myths remained alive even while more intellectual readings developed. Over time, however, the farther interpretation moved toward metaphysics, the more it risked losing contact with the actual ritual life of the mysteries. In the end, one could speak in a mystery language without any longer standing inside a living cult. Myth was the oldest and most natural form of sacred explanation. In the ancient world, to speak about the gods usually meant telling stories about their actions, their sufferings, their journeys, their loves, their losses, and their powers. Mystery cults were deeply shaped by this mythic mode. Each major mystery tradition had its own divine story, and the rite was often inseparable from that story. Demeter and Persephone, Isis and Osiris, Attis and the Mother, Dionysus in his multiple forms, all belonged to this world. Their myths were not simply decorative backgrounds. They gave structure to ritual and explained why certain actions, emotions, and symbols were repeated in the sacred setting. Some myths survive in rich detail, while others remain frustratingly incomplete. The story of Demeter and Persephone can be followed through multiple retellings, and the same is true for Isis and Osiris. The myth of Attis is much harder to reconstruct, depending heavily on one important line of transmission. Dionysus presents another challenge. There are many myths about him, but one story in particular became strongly tied to mystery language. The tale of the child Dionysus, his violent destruction, and the strange inheritance of humanity. Ancient writers hint that this story was once treated as sacred knowledge not spoken openly, though later it entered more public circulation. The most difficult case of all is Mithras. The visual evidence makes it clear that there was a mythic sequence behind Mithraic worship. Reliefs show a structured chain of scenes surrounding the central image of the god slaying the bull. There are hints of divine conflict, cosmic succession, pursuit, combat, sacrifice, feasting, and ascent. Yet the actual narrative that once connected these images has been lost. No surviving text tells the story in full. A few names, a few symbolic clues, and the sequence of carved scenes are all that remain. This makes Mithras especially revealing. A mystery cult could clearly possess a powerful myth without preserving it for posterity in a literary form accessible to later generations. In several traditions, certain parts of the myth appear to have been treated as especially secret. These were often the strangest, most violent, or most sexually charged elements. There are hints of hidden births, forbidden unions, mutilations, dismemberments, and other disturbing episodes. Yet even such shocking fragments cannot have been the entire secret of the mysteries. On their own, they would mean little. Their force came from being embedded in a larger sacred structure of preparation, symbol, explanation, and emotional experience. The myth alone did not make the mystery. The mystery gave the myth its ritual life. For a long time, scholars tried to define mystery cults, mainly through the idea of the suffering god. There is some truth in that approach. Many of the major mystery traditions do center on a divine figure connected with loss, grief, death, or catastrophe. Persephone is taken away. Demeter suffers and mourns. Osiris is killed and sought. Dionysus is torn apart in one powerful strand of tradition. Attis is linked to blood, loss, and lamentation. In ritual life, mourning often gives way to joy. Sorrow is followed by recovery, rediscovery, or celebration. This pattern is deeply important, but it should not be pushed too far. The old idea of a universal dying and rising god behind all these cults no longer fits the evidence well. Attis does not simply return in a clear resurrection narrative. Osiris remains strongly connected to the world of the dead. Persephone returns, but not in a way that makes the initiates themselves follow her path directly. The mysteries do include a movement from grief to relief, from danger to salvation, and from darkness to rejoicing. But the exact language of rebirth is often absent or far less explicit than later interpreters wanted it to be. At the same time, myths of divine suffering were not limited to mystery cults. Adonis provides a striking example of a powerful mourning tradition without a mystery structure of the classic kind. Heracles also undergoes suffering, death, and ascent, yet no major mystery cult of Heracles took shape in the same way. In Egypt and Mesopotamia too, divine suffering could be central without producing Greco-Roman style mysteries. And once again, Mithras stands outside the pattern. He does not fit naturally into the category of the suffering god at all. His myth is one of action, conquest, pursuit, and sacrifice, not of lamented death followed by restoration. This alone shows that no single theological formula can explain all mystery traditions. There is another use of myth that may be even older than the drama of divine suffering. In some mysteries, myth seems to function as a charter of privilege, almost a sacred genealogy. The initiate does not merely watch the divine story, the initiate learns to place himself inside it. The gold tablets associated with Bacchic religion preserve a striking example. The dead initiate declares descent from earth and starry heaven. This is not just poetry. It is a claim of origin, a statement that the initiate belongs to a higher lineage known only through sacred knowledge. Elsewhere, there are hints that access to the mysteries required proof of belonging to the race of the gods in some ritual or symbolic sense. Even philosophical texts, preserving echoes of mystery language, speak of kinship among initiates, and even kinship with the divine. These hints are fragmentary, but they point toward a very ancient way of speaking about religious privilege. The mystery did not only promise blessing, it gave a person a new place within a sacred family of origins. At the same time, myth also worked in a looser and more playful way inside the rites. Ritual actions could be explained by small details from the divine story. The initiates did this because the goddess had done it. They carried torches because the goddess had searched with torches. They fasted because she had fasted. They broke the fast because she had done so at a certain moment. A sacred silence, a ritual laugh, the tasting of a drink, the sitting upon a certain object, all could be tied back to the actions of the deity in myth. These connections did not necessarily form a grand doctrine, but they created a living framework in which every gesture acquired divine precedent. The same pattern appears in the cults of Isis and the mother goddess. Worshippers imitate the grief of the goddess, then share in her joy when the lost one is found again. The priests of the mother embody the fate of Attis through their own bodily condition, while ritual objects such as the pine tree carry multiple mythic meanings at once. The tree can be the setting of the god's death, the sign of his beloved, or the focus of divine anger and ritual display. Dionysiac rites, too, are filled with objects that seem to echo the god's mythic story, from sacred containers to ritual implements and symbolic playthings. In these cases, myth does not appear as a system explained from beginning to end. It appears in flashes, correspondences, and ritual mirrors, enough to make the experience meaningful without turning it into a fixed theology. This brings the discussion to the second major level of interpretation: allegory. Modern readers often have little patience for allegory in religious history because it can seem dry, artificial, or overly clever. But in Antiquity, it had a very important role, especially in the mysteries. There are two main forms of allegorical thinking. One starts with a set of abstract ideas and clothes them in symbolic story. The other begins with an inherited tale and tries to decode it by relating it to some more rational pattern, often drawn from nature. It is this second kind that matters here. Beginning especially in the later classical and Hellenistic world, mystery rituals were often explained in terms of natural processes. This was not necessarily an attempt to destroy religion. In many cases, it was an effort to make the strange, emotional, and secretive elements of ritual appear meaningful to a more reflective mind. The mysteries, with their darkness, secrecy, emotional tension, and strange symbols, almost invited this kind of explanation. They seemed to conceal something behind their surface. Allegory promised to uncover it. Ancient writers say very clearly that mysteries and allegory belong together because both work through concealment. The hidden meaning is more powerful than the obvious one. What is not fully stated arouses awe, fear, and reverence. Nature itself was often imagined as something that does not reveal its secrets openly. In that sense, to interpret ritual allegorically was to imitate the hidden style of the cosmos. The mysteries concealed, nature concealed, and the wise interpreter tried to pass from one hidden layer to the other. This habit of interpretation could be welcomed or attacked. Some saw it as a way of reaching truth through sacred form. Others mocked it, saying that the mysteries were teaching people about natural processes rather than about gods. But whatever the judgment, the practice became widespread. It was especially useful because it allowed initiates and priests to answer a difficult question. Why all this darkness, secrecy, lamentation, and strange symbolism? Allegory could say that behind the rite stood the cycle of life, death, growth, and return found everywhere in nature. At Eleusis, for example, Demeter could easily be understood as earth itself, Persephone as grain or as the life that descends and reappears, and the sacred ear of grain shown in the rite as the perfect image of growth through death. Such interpretations may have gone beyond intellectual explanation and entered religious imagination itself. If grain was buried and rose again, if the dead too returned to the womb of the universal mother, then natural allegory began to merge with hope. A symbolic object like the ear of grain could stand between nature and faith, without clearly belonging to one alone. The same happened in the cult of the mother goddess. She too could be explained as earth, and the violent features of her ritual were then read in agricultural terms. Castration became the cutting of grain. Blood and wounds became images of the plough opening the soil. Bathing the goddess or her sacred objects signified irrigation. However strange this may seem, it offered a logic that joined ritual drama to the yearly rhythms of survival. Even hymns could absorb this language, so that allegory moved from interpretation into devotion itself. Dionysus presents another famous case. His link to vine and wine was always obvious, but allegorical interpretation could push the connection much further, making every detail of his dismemberment correspond to stages in the production of wine. In this way, a violent sacred myth became readable as a hidden account of natural transformation. Elsewhere, gods could be identified with celestial powers, and sacred stories could be reinterpreted as expressions of solar or cosmic truth. Such readings may feel rationalizing, but in antiquity they often deepened rather than reduced the religious aura of the rites. Natural allegory became especially powerful in the cult of Isis and Osiris. In fact, once Egyptian religion entered the Greek-speaking world, this kind of interpretation became one of the main ways people explained the cult as a whole, not just its secret rites. The roots of this approach were already present in older Egyptian tradition. Osiris had long been linked to the Nile, the river whose waters retreat, diminish, and then return again with life-giving force. The Nile was not simply a river in this religious imagination. It was the pulse of survival itself, the source of fertility, harvest, and renewal. In ritual, this connection was made visible. Sacred vessels filled with Nile water appeared in ceremonies and processions, and sanctuaries could even recreate the flooding of the river in symbolic form. The god was therefore not only spoken about in myth, he could be experienced through the movement of living water. From there, allegorical interpretation came almost naturally. One of the simplest and most influential explanations identified Isis with the earth, Osiris with the Nile, and Typhon with the sea into which the river ultimately vanishes. In that reading, myth became a way of speaking about the natural order. The drama of the gods was the drama of the world itself. Fertility, loss, dispersal, return. Greek and Egyptian religious thought met at exactly this point, because the Greeks had already linked Isis with Demeter, another great goddess of the earth and of agricultural life. Once that identification took hold, the cult of Isis seemed to contain both foreign wisdom and familiar symbolic truth. The mysteries no longer belonged only to an exotic priesthood from the south. They could be understood as expressing patterns visible in the cycle of the land, the seasons, and the survival of humankind. This type of explanation was not confined to outsiders trying to make sense of a foreign cult. Priests themselves took part in it. Sacred ritual could be defended and illuminated through the language of nature. Some Egyptian interpreters presented Isis as the fruit-bearing force, active in both the earth and the moon, while Osiris became the productive power within the Nile. Other, more elaborate theories described Osiris as the generative power of moisture in general, with Isis remaining the receptive and governing force of the earth. In such readings, the myth was lifted above a local story and made to describe the hidden forces working through the cosmos. The movement from mourning to joy within the ritual year could then be matched with the movement of the seasons, the disappearance and return of fertility, the death and renewal that sustained crops, rivers, and time itself. Osiris could even become grain itself, scattered, hidden, and found again. None of these interpretations replaced the older rites. The ceremonies continued in their inherited form, but the possibility of discovering a rational and natural meaning beneath them added a special fascination. It gave the cult an intellectual aura while preserving its secrecy. That union of hidden ritual and philosophical explanation helped create the impression that Isis offered something uniquely profound. Mithras presents a very different but equally striking case. The connection between Mithras and the sun was established early and remained constant. In inscriptions, the god is invoked again and again alongside solar power. Yet the imagery of the cult does not simply collapse Mithras into the sun god. The two remain distinct figures, even when they are closely associated. What stands out instead is the intensely cosmic character of the entire Mithraic system. In the cults of Demeter, Dionysus, Isis, and the mother goddess, natural allegory often feels like a later layer laid over older myths that still carry an unruly and deeply human shape. In Mithraism, cosmic symbolism seems to belong much closer to the foundation. The sacred cave itself represents the universe. Its vaulted form echoes the heavens. Zodiac signs appear above. The 7 grades of initiation correspond to the 7 planetary powers. The central scene of the bull slaying is set not in an ordinary landscape, but within a world framed by the rising sun and the descending moon. Even so, the meanings are not entirely fixed. The bull may be tied to lunar symbolism, but that does not exhaust the ritual or the image. The act of sacrifice remains larger than any single interpretation. Solar movement shaped the cult directly. Some Mithraic sanctuaries were designed so that sunlight would enter at particular times and strike the central relief, illuminating the god with dramatic precision. Agriculture appears again as part of the sacred story, since the tail of the dying bull can turn into ears of grain. Mithras also appears in some images as a guardian of vegetation, water, and cultivated life. Yet the surviving evidence is incomplete enough that many details remain uncertain. No explanatory body of texts survives to tell the full story. The images suggest much more than the surviving words can confirm. This lack of full clarity is important. Even within Mithraism, where cosmic symbolism is unusually strong, tensions remain. The relationships between the initiation grades and the planets are not entirely consistent from one source to another. The role of Helios is too large to fit neatly into a simple planetary system. The sun and moon seem to stand apart from the 7 wandering stars, even though scientific cosmology would place them within the same larger order. This suggests that Mithraism did not simply grow out of a clean astronomical theory. Older symbolic habits, older ritual structures, and older religious instincts continue to shape it. The cosmic reading was real, but it did not erase earlier layers of thought. Astrology formed one further development within this cosmic environment. Unlike the other mystery cults, Mithraism seems to have absorbed astrological thinking to a noticeable degree. Some inscriptions point towards celestial calculations and planetary associations. At least one literary interpretation explains the slaying of the bull in terms of the sun's passage through the sign of Taurus. This is presented as an inner explanation of the rites, though even ancient authors admit it may not have been the only or the most common one. Later, interpreters have often tried to push this much further, treating the whole of Mithraic myth as an astrological code. That may go too far. Astrology is flexible enough to be fitted almost anywhere, and once every detail is made to yield celestial significance, interpretation risks becoming limitless. Still, astrology did provide one more language through which the rites could be made meaningful. It was another attempt to explain what the cult was doing, another layer of thought added to an already dense, symbolic world. But it is likely that the mysteries themselves were older than these explanations. A third level of interpretation emerges when metaphysics takes the place once held by simple nature allegory. This turn is especially clear in philosophical readings of Isis and Osiris. Instead of saying that Isis is the earth and Osiris the Nile in a straightforward physical sense, more reflective thinkers argued that such explanations remained too crude. Earth and water by themselves could not be the true divine principles. They were only the visible surfaces through which deeper, incorporeal powers worked. Myth then had to be raised to another level. Isis became not merely soil, but the receptive principle that receives form. Osiris became the good and ordering force. Typhon became the power of disruption, division, and ruin. The myth was no longer just a poetic account of rivers and crops. It became a drama of metaphysical opposition, a struggle between ordering intelligence and destructive dispersal, working upon the substrate of the material world. Once this kind of interpretation began, mysteries became increasingly attractive to Platonizing minds. Philosophers found in them a symbolic confirmation of truths they believed reason could already reach. Mystery rites offered images, actions, and old sacred names that could be attached to abstract ideas about unity and multiplicity, being and becoming, order and dissolution. In this way, myth and ritual could be pulled upward into metaphysical speculation. At times, philosophers seem to have felt that by explaining the mysteries in this way, they were disclosing something dangerously close to the forbidden core of the rites. Yet the movement continued. The ritual world remained, but around it there grew a cloud of interpretation, shaped by philosophy more than by inherited ceremony. This can be seen clearly in later reinterpretations of Demeter, Attis, and Dionysus. Certain details that once belonged to ritual drama or local sacred story were lifted into vast metaphysical schemes. Even the most shocking and physical elements, such as castration in the cult of Attis, could be reimagined as symbols of cosmic restraint. In this reading, overflowing generative force must at some point be halted so that being does not dissolve into uncontrolled multiplication. What had looked grotesque or brutal at the level of myth now became a symbolic statement about the structure of reality. However strange such reasoning may seem, it mattered deeply to late pagan thinkers. It allowed them to preserve old rites by giving them a new philosophical dignity. The same happened with Dionysus. His dismemberment, one of the most violent themes in all ancient myth, was drawn into speculative thought about unity broken into plurality, restored again. The god, divided and scattered, could stand for a divine principle dispersed into the visible world of many bodies and forms. The movement toward restoration then became a return to primordial unity. Myth was no longer just sacred story. It became a coded account of metaphysical process. This type of interpretation reached its fullest form in later Platonism, where mystery language and philosophical speculation could become so closely joined that it was hard to tell where ritual memory ended and pure logos began. Mithras, too, was eventually drawn into this higher level of explanation. The cave became the cosmos, not just poetically, but philosophically. The god became a creator figure, a divine power standing at the center of the ordered universe. Yet even here, the surviving evidence remains incomplete. It is not fully clear whether Mithraism aimed at escape from the cosmos, mastery within it, or faithful endurance under its structure. What can be said with confidence is that later interpreters projected philosophical meaning into it. They treated the visible ritual world of Mithras as a sign of deeper truths about the universe and the soul. But those explanations likely belonged more to learned reflection than to the shared understanding of the average initiate. That point leads to one of the most revealing features of all. For modern readers, religions of salvation are often expected to revolve around the soul. It seems natural to assume that mysteries promising blessing, purification, or a better destiny would have placed doctrines of the soul at the centre. Yet the actual evidence is surprisingly thin. In the mysteries of Eleusis, Dionysus, the mother goddess, Isis, and Mithras, there is very little direct and systematic teaching about the soul itself. Hopes about death and afterlife certainly appear. Consolation appears. Promises appear. But a developed doctrine of the soul is rare. In that sense, the mysteries were personal, but not always spiritual in the later philosophical sense. Where such teaching does appear, it stands out sharply. The most famous example is the doctrine of transmigration, the belief that the soul passes through repeated lives. This idea appears in Greek thought toward the end of the 6th century before Christ, and is associated especially with names like Pythagoras and Orpheus. There are ancient statements that such doctrines were spoken of in initiatory settings and accepted by certain believers. Poetic texts and gold leaves connected with Bacchic religion seem at least compatible with such a view, and some philosophical passages preserve the idea that the soul is imprisoned in the body as punishment for ancient crimes, waiting for eventual release. Priests of mysteries and Orphic teaching are connected with this language. Even so, what is striking is how limited this evidence remains. It is concentrated in a relatively narrow period, and beyond that period, the doctrine does not appear as a universal feature of mystery cult practice. The impression is of an intense but partial fusion, not of a permanent and essential bond. Transmigration seems to have entered some forms of mystery religion from outside, perhaps through texts, teachers, and speculative circles influenced by Orphic tradition. But the mysteries themselves did not wholly depend on it, nor did the doctrine depend entirely on mystery ritual for its survival. It lived on because philosophers, especially those shaped by Plato, found in it a powerful tool for speculation about justice, destiny, and the soul's journey. This reveals something fundamental about mystery theology as a whole. Even where ideas became elevated, daring, and close to dogma, they retained an experimental quality. Myth, allegory, cosmic symbolism, metaphysics, and anthropology could all be attached to the rites, but none of them fully mastered the rites. No single doctrine became the final and universally accepted meaning of the mysteries. The rituals were older, broader, and more flexible than any explanation built around them. People could interpret them through agriculture, through seasonal return, through the Nile, through stars, through planets, through Platonic principles, or through theories of the soul. Each approach illuminated something real. None of them exhausted the whole. One ancient voice, broken by grief after the death of a child, cries out in despair to forget the sacred rites altogether. Another voice from within a hymn asks the goddess of memory to preserve forever the solemn experience of initiation in the minds of the faithful. Between those two reactions lies one of the deepest truths about the ancient mysteries. They were expected to do something real, not merely to symbolize hope, but to leave a mark on the soul strong enough to survive the rest of life. A mystery festival was meant to be more than a ceremony. It was supposed to become an event a person could never fully leave behind. Ancient authors occasionally speak of this in unusually direct language. They say that initiation did not only involve being taught something, it involved undergoing something. At the highest point, the initiate was not simply expected to learn with the mind, but to be acted upon, changed inwardly, carried into another state. That distinction is crucial. The mystery was not just information, it was a pathos, an experience that entered the soul and altered its condition. In a world that often described religion through ritual action, rather than inner analysis, this is a striking admission. The rites were designed to produce a specific psychological and spiritual effect. One ancient comparison makes this especially vivid. It imagines bringing a man, whether Greek or foreigner, into a great hidden hall full of overwhelming sights and sounds, sudden alternations of darkness and light, sacred movement, ritual dance, and all the bewildering impressions of initiation. The question is then asked, could such a person really pass through all of this and feel nothing in his soul? Of course not. Something would happen within him. Confusion would begin to shift into wonder. Disorder would begin to suggest hidden design. What first seemed strange and threatening would start to feel meaningful. This is one of the clearest glimpses into the expected psychological outcome of the mysteries. Their aim was not passive observation. Their aim was transformation through controlled astonishment. That helps explain why ancient thinkers could place mystery rites among the most convincing signs of divine care. Alongside dreams, visions, and miraculous healing, initiation could count as one of those moments when a human being encountered something greater than ordinary life. The ritual did not simply represent the divine from a safe distance. It staged an immediate brush with otherness. In modern terms, it worked by changing consciousness. It pushed the initiate beyond everyday habits of perception and emotion into a condition where the world, the gods, and the self no longer appeared quite the same. Yet this is exactly where modern understanding reaches its limits. Even if the secrecy of the mysteries had not been so carefully guarded, a full description would still not solve the problem. Observation is not the same as participation. To stand outside the gate and hear a cry, to glimpse a flash of fire above a wall, or even to read a hostile account is not to know what the experience felt like from within. There were days of preparation, fasting, waiting, purification, exhaustion, anxiety, and heightened expectation before the climactic moment arrived. Without that background, the final revelation could easily seem absurd, trivial, or disappointingly simple. Sacred force depended on sequence, mood, and readiness. Remove those, and the rite became only a fragment. This is one reason why exposed secrets so often look disappointing on paper. A bare report may tell that an ear of grain was shown, or that a cry about divine birth was shouted into the night. But these details by themselves do not reproduce the reality of the event. They become symbols detached from their atmosphere. Whatever they meant to those who had passed through the full rhythm of the ceremony cannot be recovered simply by repeating the words. The mystery did not live in the object alone, or in the spoken formula alone. It lived in the total emotional structure built around them. Some of the richest evidence survives in metaphorical form, when ancient writers borrow the language of initiation to describe other overwhelming experiences. One especially powerful example compares death itself to passing through a mystery. At first there is wandering, fear, darkness, disorientation, and the sense of moving through threatening places that seem to lead nowhere. Then, just before the end, come terror, trembling, sweat, and astonishment. After that, suddenly, light. Pure regions open up. Sacred meadows appear. There are dances, solemn sounds, holy visions. The initiate, now released and crowned, walks freely in the company of the pure, looking down on the confused and unpurified world below. Whether or not this exactly reflects one specific rite, It reveals how the emotional pattern of the mysteries was imagined. First dread, then revelation. First destabilization, then blessed clarity. Plato's famous use of mystery imagery works in a similar way. When he describes the soul's vision of true beauty and its memory of divine reality, he turns again to the language of initiation. There is sacred vision, a blessed procession, the joy of pure spectacle, and the sense that what was once seen in splendor cannot be forgotten. His language draws strongly on real ritual forms but transforms them into a philosophical vision. That matters because it shows how powerful the memory of mystery experience had become in Greek culture. It offered the best available language for describing the soul's encounter with something that exceeded normal speech. Certain patterns appear again and again in these descriptions. The mysteries move through opposites: terror and joy, darkness and light, disorientation and meaning, humiliation and exaltation. The initiate does not begin in harmony. The initiate is first unsettled. This is why ancient writers speak of fright, sweating, trembling, confusion, and the strain of bearing up through the first stages. Yet all of this is endured in hope that something sweet and luminous will emerge from the present confusion. The final state is then often described through the language of blessedness. To have seen the mysteries is to have entered a superior condition. But the texts repeatedly suggest that the true power lies not simply in emotional release, but in the act of seeing something held to be divine. When attention turns to the rites themselves, the evidence becomes frustratingly scattered. Eleusis offers the richest, but still incomplete case. The sanctuary, the myth of Demeter. Relief scenes showing ritual moments, brief sacred formulas, and a few exposed hints from hostile or outsider texts all help reconstruct an outline. But none of them gives the whole. The preparatory formula associated with Eleusis suggests fasting, drinking the sacred mixture, handling hidden ritual containers, and performing some act involving grain. This is practical, physical, and elusive all at once. Reliefs show sacrifice, purification, and the approach of the initiate toward the divine figures of Demeter and Kor. In one scene, the initiate touches a snake without fear, suggesting entry into a state beyond normal human anxiety. In another, the initiate sits veiled on a fleece in a posture of ritual transformation. These are not random decorative details. They point to fear mastered, purification undergone, and sacred encounter approached. Yet even here, the final meaning remains withheld. The sanctuary itself adds another layer. Certain hidden features suggest darker or more frightening phases of the rite. Perhaps moments of disorientation or dissent before the final communal revelation. But once again, all reconstruction remains partial. The line between private preparatory initiation and the great shared celebration cannot be traced with certainty. Eleusis remains powerful precisely because it gives glimpses without yielding a complete script. The Dionysiac mysteries present a different kind of evidence, shaped especially by visual art. Wall paintings, stucco reliefs, sarcophagi, and mosaics preserve scenes that look unmistakably initiatory. The most striking image is the unveiling of the phallus in the winnowing basket. This is a hierophantic moment, the revelation of a sacred object. On its own, such an object is no great secret. But within ritual, its meaning changes. It becomes charged with divine power, sexuality, fertility, and perhaps the shock of sacred disclosure. In the great painted cycle from Pompeii, the sequence seems to move from approach and preparation through temporary vision, alarm, humiliation, revelation, and finally ecstatic release. A frightening winged figure raises a rod. A kneeling initiate is exposed. A dancer spins free in the next scene. Here again, the pattern is unmistakable. Something difficult and unsettling is followed by liberation. Earlier literary evidence about Dionysiac initiation confirms this structure in another form. Candidates sit, are smeared with material that marks them out, hear cries from the darkness, undergo purification, then rise and proclaim that they have escaped evil and found something better. By day, they rejoin the procession, crowned and carried into the shared life of the cult. Snakes, cries, music, rhythmic movement, and the change from fear to participation define the experience. Psychological destabilization is followed by reintegration under a new sacred identity. This is not an abstract doctrine. It is a ritual remaking of the self. The mysteries of Isis survive in one especially famous literary portrait. It is the only ancient first-person account of a mystery initiation that remains in anything like full form, though it is deliberately elusive. The initiate approaches the boundary of death, passes the threshold of the underworld, moves through the elements, sees the sun at midnight, and comes close to gods above and below. This is all said in a way meant to frustrate direct curiosity. The author wants the reader near the threshold of understanding, but not across it. What emerges most clearly is the emotional and symbolic structure. The initiate has gone to the edge of death and returned. Fire, light, purification, and cosmic passage all play their part. The next morning, he is displayed publicly in radiant clothing as one who has undergone a new condition. Once again, the rite works by night through secrecy, danger, and transformation, then by day through recognition and reintegration. With the mother goddess and related rites, yet another pattern appears. Older evidence points to ecstatic ritual in which the initiate is seated while others dance wildly around him. The atmosphere is collective, disorienting, and intense. Later, evidence includes a short, sacred formula built around eating, drinking, carrying ritual objects, and passing beneath a curtained space suggestive of union or transition. This already hints at crossing a threshold. More dramatic still is the Taurobolium, where the initiate is drenched in the blood of a sacrificed bull. The emotional force of such an event hardly needs explanation. Terror, disgust, shock, and overwhelming release would all be part of its effect. When the initiate emerged afterward as one who had passed through that ordeal, the contrast itself would generate a sense of renewal. In such a case, the practical and magical purpose of the rite may have outweighed any subtle theology. But the psychological effect must have been enormous. Mithras stands apart more sharply than ever. Here, initiation is not occasional but central, multiplied into 7 grades that structure the entire cult. Every ascent through these levels must have involved its own ritual trial, preparation, and incorporation. Yet the evidence for the exact details is thin. Some late hostile texts mention blindfolding, animal cries, mock threats, simulated death, fire, and dramatic release. Frescoes and scattered remains seem to support at least some of this. A candidate may have been bound, led in darkness, startled by symbolic violence, or suddenly freed by a ritual saviour figure. Fire, danger, and mock execution may all have had a place. In one form or another, Mithraic initiation seems to have involved ordeals much closer to what anthropologists would recognise in initiatory systems elsewhere in the world. In this respect, Mithras appears almost more openly archaic than the other major mysteries. It is often tempting to explain all of these rites through one formula: death and rebirth. There is no doubt that this pattern is present in some form. The language of new birth appears in relation to Isis, Mithras, and other cults. The initiate may receive a new birthday. The rite may be spoken of as a voluntary death followed by salvation. In some cases, myths behind the ritual clearly involve catastrophe followed by restoration. But the evidence is too varied to reduce everything to one flat theory. At Eleusis, there are many images rather than one. descent, grain cut and replanted, the child in the fire, the return of Persephone, the birth of a sacred child. In Dionysiac settings there is death, dismemberment, underworld symbolism, but no simple ritual replay of resurrection. In the cult of Meter there is blood and renewal, but not a fixed doctrine of rebirth. Across the mysteries, what is constant is not one formula but a dynamic paradox. Life through contact with death, joy through passage across terror, light discovered through darkness. This is why comparisons with later religious language about dying and rising can illuminate certain aspects of the mysteries, but cannot fully explain them. The ancient rites do not usually speak in the same direct and doctrinal way. Their transformation is enacted, symbolic and plural. It is shown through multiple images rather than declared through one creed. The question of baptism has often been raised in this context, but here too caution is necessary. Purifications with water certainly existed everywhere. There was washing, sprinkling, and ritual cleansing. But that is not the same as baptism in the later, more specific sense of immersion into a new life. Some apparent parallels disappear when the visual and ritual context is examined more carefully. Water in Isis cult, for example, often represents the Nile rather than a symbolic death and rebirth through immersion. Even where Christian initiation later borrowed details found in pagan settings, such as night celebration, instruction, milk and honey, or the use of skins, this does not prove that pagan mysteries possess the same structure or meaning. Parallel practice does not equal identical theology. Then, there are the darker questions that have always fascinated outsiders. Did the mysteries use torture? Was there sexual excess? Were drugs involved? These questions are understandable, because secrecy naturally attracts suspicion. The evidence, however, demands careful distinction. Some form of ordeal seems likely in Mithraic initiation. Late testimonies suggest humiliating, painful, and frightening tests, designed to shake the initiate's identity and prepare him for change. This fits a very broad anthropological pattern. Symbolic violence, mock death, fear, and release are all common tools in rites of passage. Mithras, once again, fits that structure more closely than the other mysteries. Elsewhere, however, physical cruelty is less visible. Psychological terror is much better attested than bodily injury. There may have been painful marks, tattoos, or exceptional acts of discipline in some settings, but the dominant pattern seems to be emotional destabilization, rather than sustained physical abuse. Even the famous flagellation scene in the Villa of the Mysteries remains deliberately ambiguous. It may show literal caning, or it may represent divine frenzy, purification, or symbolic correction in visual form. Its power lies precisely in that uncertainty. As for sex, the Mysteries undeniably used sexual symbolism. Phallic processions, unveiled sacred objects, divine unions, and the movement from youth to marriage all belong to the ritual world of Dionysus in particular. In some contexts, initiation may have overlapped with preparation for adult sexuality or marriage. Funerary and ritual art repeatedly joins male and female figures in Bacchic settings, suggesting that erotic imagery had sacred value. But symbolism should not be confused with uncontrolled bodily orgy. Even hostile evidence about sexual violation in the Bacchanalia may preserve some distorted memory of real abuse. But what became durable in ritual tradition was symbolic sexuality, not permanent institutionalized assault. It was the sign, the image, the charged unveiling, the encounter with power through representation that survived and mattered most. Among the many forms of initiation in the ancient world, some carried strong and unmistakable sexual symbolism. Yet even here, the meaning was rarely as direct as it might first appear. In the rites associated with Sabazius, for example, a striking ritual is described. A metal snake was passed beneath the clothing of the initiate, This act was understood as a form of contact with the divine, sometimes described as the god entering through the body itself. Ancient myth offers parallels that help explain the symbolism. The union of a god in serpent form with a goddess, or the presence of sacred snakes in Dionysian rituals, was already linked to themes of divine fertility and generation. But the ritual itself adds another layer of transformation. The snake stands in place of something else, and even the snake is no longer real, but an object. Meaning is filtered through multiple levels of representation. What remains most powerful is not simply the idea of sexuality, but the emotional tension created by the act itself. In the dim and uncertain light of torches, the initiate could not fully know what was real and what was crafted. The sensation, the anticipation, and the fear of contact played a greater role than any clear symbolic explanation. The effect was immediate and physical, but also psychological, rooted in uncertainty and controlled shock. In contrast, the rites of Eleusis were widely praised for their sense of purity. This reputation did not necessarily exclude all forms of symbolic or even suggestive action, but explicit sexual imagery appears to have been absent or at least carefully concealed. Certain divine figures connected to fertility and growth were present in the broader mythic background, yet the rituals themselves avoided overt display. Whatever deeper actions may have taken place during the night, ceremonies remained successfully hidden. Even ancient observers could only speculate about what was truly done, if anything beyond what was already known. A very different atmosphere surrounded the mysteries of Mithras. Here, sexuality seems to have been pushed into the background, replaced by themes of strength, discipline, and controlled power. Some traditions even claimed that this cult excluded women entirely. Yet the visual language of Mithraic imagery still hints at deeper concerns. The central scene of the bull being slain includes curious details focused on the animal's body, especially its generative parts. Blood, seed, and transformation appear together in a symbolic system that suggests life emerging from destruction. Fertility is present, but it is expressed through cosmic imagery rather than human intimacy. The cult of the Great Mother presents yet another variation. Here, sexuality is not simply present or absent, but transformed through radical denial. The act of self-castration, which became associated with some of the most devoted followers, turns the generative force into something to be renounced. Instead of celebrating fertility directly, the ritual redirects attention to control, sacrifice, and the limits of human desire. This makes the theme even more intense, not less. The rejection of sexuality becomes its own powerful statement, shaping the identity of those who participated. The case of Isis offers a different kind of paradox. At first glance, the rituals appear restrained and almost austere. The shaved heads of priests, the linen garments, the processions, the use of water and incense, all suggest order and discipline rather than excess. Yet beneath this surface, the myths connected to the cult revolve around union, loss, and restoration. Stories of divine partnership and regeneration linger in the background. Occasional incidents hint that some followers interpreted these themes in very literal ways, though such episodes often caused scandal and were treated as violations rather than normal practice. At the same time, strict preparation for initiation often included periods of sexual abstinence. This detail is important. By withholding ordinary experience, the ritual heightened sensitivity to whatever followed. Symbolic gestures, even subtle ones, could take on greater meaning in such a context. There are hints that certain acts involving union or proximity may have existed in highly controlled forms, but they remained hidden behind layers of secrecy. The language used to describe them suggests that they were not meant for public understanding. Over time, the language of mystery initiation became a way to speak about desire itself, influenced by philosophical thought, especially the idea that love could lead the soul toward higher realities. References to initiation began to appear in discussions of relationships and attraction. Lovers could speak as if they were guiding one another into sacred knowledge. At the same time, this language could also be used for humor or satire, suggesting that outsiders often imagined the secrets of the mysteries in exaggerated or distorted ways. Rumors of extreme behavior were common. Stories circulated about hidden rites involving forbidden acts, especially in groups considered suspicious or unconventional. Such accusations were not limited to one tradition. They appeared in many contexts, often reflecting fear or misunderstanding rather than reality. Even when unusual practices did exist, they rarely formed a stable or lasting part of ritual life. What endured was not uncontrolled action, but structured symbolism shaped by tradition. Another question that has drawn attention is the possible use of substances to alter perception. In modern times, it is tempting to assume that intense religious experiences must have been supported by chemical means. Some have suggested that certain ingredients used in ritual drinks could have had mild effects on the mind. Others have speculated about plants or fungi that might produce visions. While these ideas are intriguing, the practical challenges are significant. Providing such substances in controlled and meaningful ways to large groups would have been difficult. Moreover, the known effects of many of these materials do not match the kind of structured and shared experience described in the sources. More importantly, the nature of the mysteries suggests something different. Their power lay in collective experience, not individual isolation. The ceremonies were public events in the sense that they involved groups, even if access was restricted. They unfolded within a shared space, guided by ritual specialists, and followed a sequence that many could undergo together. This does not fit easily with the kind of solitary or unpredictable experiences often associated with strong substances. The transformation sought in the mysteries depended on rhythm, repetition, and participation, not on uncontrolled visions. A more grounded and consistent feature across many of these traditions is communal feasting. After periods of preparation, fasting, and tension, participants often shared in meals that were both symbolic and practical. These gatherings were not merely decorative. They reinforced the sense of belonging and completion that followed the ritual. In some cases, wine played a central role. In others, meat from sacrificed animals was consumed. The act of eating together created a bond that extended beyond the moment of initiation. In Eleusis, after the night of intense experience, there were large-scale sacrifices followed by shared meals. In the cult of the Great Mother, offerings of animals provided food for those involved. In the worship of Isis and related deities, organized banquets took place in specially prepared settings. In Mithraic communities, archaeological remains show clear evidence of regular communal dining. The imagery associated with these groups often depicts divine figures sharing a meal, suggesting that human participants were imitating a sacred model. These meals combined ordinary enjoyment with deeper meaning. They were moments of release after strain, of satisfaction after deprivation. At the same time, they echoed the larger pattern of life and death that underlay the rituals themselves. The act of sacrifice, which involves taking life in order to sustain life, was transformed into a shared experience of renewal. In this sense, and the feast was not separate from the mystery. It was its natural conclusion. Speculation about more specific forms of sacred consumption has often gone further. Some have imagined that initiates consumed substances representing the divine itself. While certain myths and symbolic actions might suggest such ideas, clear evidence remains limited. What can be observed is a broader pattern in which ritual eating reflects the relationship between humans and the forces that sustain them. The emphasis is less on literal transformation through consumption and more on participation in a shared cycle. Beyond all these elements, there remains the question of altered states. In some traditions, especially those connected to Dionysus and the Great Mother, there is clear evidence of ecstatic behavior. Music, rhythm, movement, and collective emotion could produce states in which individuals felt carried beyond themselves. This was not random chaos, but a controlled form of release. The experience could be intense, even overwhelming, but it was framed by ritual context. Not everyone reached this state. Some participants remained observers. Others were deeply affected. The variation itself is important. It suggests that the mysteries did not impose a single experience on all participants. Instead, they created conditions in which different responses could emerge. For some, the result was confusion or fear. For others, it was joy or a sense of connection with something greater. Ancient observers sometimes tried to explain these experiences in simple terms. Lack of sleep, loud sounds, darkness, and emotional build-up could certainly affect the mind. These factors were real. But reducing the entire phenomenon to them misses the point. The mysteries were not accidental combinations of stimuli. They were carefully shaped events designed to guide participants through a sequence of tension and release.